All right, thank you. So hopefully you guys saw an email come through the ClinGen All listserv probably about 2 weeks ago or so now, just announcing that we have released the newest version of the gene curation SOP, which is version 8. I did not put a screenshot in here in the slide deck, but it is currently available on our website. If you go under curation activities, gene curation, and then training materials, you will find it there. Similar to as we have had in the past, we'll have a clean version PDF for you. We also have a summary document of the changes that you'll find. We have a highlighted version if you want to see where all those changes are. So that's all available on the website. But for today, I thought I would just review with you the largest changes, the most significant changes in this SOP. The main update is a revamp of our genetic evidence scoring system. And what I'm showing you here on the screen is the older version of the genetic evidence scoring system from version 7. Hopefully this is familiar to many of you, but there were a few issues that we wanted to address with this update. One is the need to downgrade missense variants without functional data. We have verbally referred to this in the text of the SOP in previous versions, but you'll notice that the default score was always that 0.5. And really what we had said in the SOP previously was that if your missense variant did not have supportive functional data, you should really be scoring those at a starting point of 0.1, but that was not really clear in what we say the default is. We found that people were kind of missing this part with some evidence of gene impact, so that was one thing we wanted to address. Another thing was that there was no distinction between the types of de novo variants. So you can see here, you may recall that de novo was its own category in the autosomal dominant or X-linked evidence type. And the default was just a blanket 2. And so people were giving 2 points for de novo loss of function variants as well as 2 points for de novo missense variants. And we thought, it might be worth it to discuss some distinctions there. There were distinct values for loss of function and de novo variants in the autosomal dominant category, but not in the autosomal recessive category. So those two things were kind of lumped together. And then we did have this concept of category maximums in the previous version, which we found would at times penalize those diseases that were not loss of function mechanisms. So say something like a gain of function, where we expect that all the causative variants would be missense, would be getting capped at this 7, and it would be kind of penalizing and making it hard to get to definitive for those diseases. So this is what the genetic evidence scoring system looks like now in version 8. The area that is boxed in red is what has changed. All of this stuff that's not boxed in red, so the segregation and the case control, that remains completely the same. So for the rest of the time, we'll be focusing on this area on top. And just at a high level, the changes are that there's now the concept of a baseline amount of points assigned per variant type, not necessarily tied to the mode of inheritance. And then from there, you add points for common upgrades. So whether or not there is functional data and whether or not the variant is de novo. And we have removed the concept of specific category maximum and leave the whole thing at the same 12 points for genetic evidence that it was before. And I will go through some examples with you guys, but before I do anything at all, I want to tell you the most important message, which is always, always, always check with your GSEP to determine final variance scoring. This framework is a guide for you to give you a sense of where you might start, a suggestion, but if for whatever reason your GSEP feels like, in this particular context, something else might be more appropriate, that is completely fine. That's in fact what we want you to do. And we just ask that you document any reason for change scoring as you normally do in the GCI. So that's like, I'll say this again and again, but I wanted to give it its own slide because it's very important. All right, so when we're evaluating case level evidence, just as before, we're only considering those variants that are plausible causes for disease. So for example, variant that's observed at a frequency in the general population that's too high to be consistent with disease shouldn't be awarded points in this system. Variants that are otherwise considered plausible causes for disease can be given a baseline number of points based on the variant type. So predicted and proven null variants in general should start at 1.5 points, and other variant types, for example, missense, should start at 0.1 points. Points can be upgraded by the default amounts listed in the table if, for example, you had functional data available to support the variant's effect on the underlying protein, and or if the variant is de novo. Note that each GSEP can specify other upgrades or downgrades that might be appropriate, like I just said. And again, always check with the GSEP regarding the final variant scoring. When evaluating biallelic variants in the context of autosomal recessive disease, evaluate each observed variant in trans independently, then sum for the final score. Always round to the nearest 0.5, except when you have biallelic missense variants without supportive functional data. In that particular case, you will round to a final score of 0.25. And note that no single proband can score more than 3 points. We don't think that should be, that should be a rare occurrence, but there are some combinations within this system that would theoretically give you more than 3 points, but we're saying don't ever score more than that. That's the cap. So I will walk you through some scoring scenarios in a moment, but first I want to review some caveats for you just to keep in mind as we continue talking about this. First, the default scores per variant assume that the variant in question is consistent with the expected disease mechanism. If this is not the case, consider downgrading or not scoring. For example, if you are evaluating a disease where the known mechanism is gain of function, consider not scoring null variants and upgrading gain of function missense variants. Always document the reasons for alternative scoring in the GCI. Also, remember that variants can be up or downgraded beyond the values suggested here, but within the scoring range based on the strength of your particular piece of evidence. So if you have a missense variant with very robust functional data that you feel like is very convincing that the variant is causative for disease, you might score beyond what we have put as the suggestion in the table. Again, always checking with the GSEP for the final appropriate variant scoring. Along the same lines, variants can be up or downgraded for reasons other than those that are specified in the table. Remember, the two things we specified were functional data and de novo. So for example, a GSEP may decide to upgrade missense variants if they're located within a known functional domain, or a GSEP could choose to downgrade variants observed in the setting of a non-specific genetically heterogeneous phenotype like autism in probands who had limited previous testing for other possible genetic etiologies. Additionally, when assigning points for de novo status, consider further upgrades if statistical evidence shows that de novo variation in a particular gene is rare. Some genes might have this kind of information, some genes might not. Use caution and consider either not grading or not scoring if a gene is known to have a high rate of de novo variation, such as something like the Titin gene. Some GSEPs have found it helpful to document these types of context-specific upgrades and downgrades to encourage consistency among their members. So check if documentation like this is available for your GSEP. And again, always include your reasoning for why you scored something the way you did in the GCI. So let's walk through a few examples. If we are evaluating an autosomal dominant or X-linked disease, the following scenarios apply. So if your variant is missense, it would start at a baseline of 0.1 points. According to the table, if supportive functional data were available, you would add 0.4 to your baseline and the resulting score would be 0.5. Similar situation if your missense variant was de novo. You could add an additional 0.4 points, bringing the total you would document in the GCI to 0.5. If you happen to have both, your missense variant did have supportive functional data and was de novo, you would sum the baseline score and both upgrades, which would give you 0.9. And after rounding to the nearest 0.5, your final score would be 1 point. For loss of function variants, the baseline score in general is 1.5 points, provided loss of function is the mechanism for disease. If there was functional evidence demonstrating that a presumed loss of function variant was actually resulting in loss of protein product, an upgrade of 0.5 points could be warranted. If the variant was found to be de novo, a 0.5 upgrade would also be warranted. And again, if you had both, you would apply both upgrades and the final score would be 2.5 points. When evaluating biallelic variants in the context of an autosomal recessive disease, remember that each variant should be evaluated separately using the scoring considerations we discussed, and the two variants should be summed to come up with the final score. So, for example, if variant 1 was a missense variant without functional data and variant 2 was a de novo loss of function variant, you would first evaluate variant 1, which is 0.1 points, then evaluate variant 2, which again, loss of function de novo, 2 points, then sum those, 2.1, round down to the nearest half, which in this case would get you down to 2, and enter this information in the GCI. So here's another autosomal recessive example. Imagine variant 1 is a missense variant with functional data. This would be worth 0.5 points. Next, imagine variant 2, which is a de novo missense variant. That would be worth 0.5 points as well. And in total, the sum for this particular program would be 1 point. And one last scoring example, again, for autosomal recessive. Say variant 1 was a loss of function variant with supportive functional data, and variant 2 is a de novo loss of function variant. Each variant represents a baseline putative loss of function score of 1.5 with at least one common upgrade. So the first one had the functional data, 0.5 points, and the second one had the de novo data, 0.5 points. Given this, we sum the score for the variance observed in trans, and that equals 4 points. But remember, at the beginning, I told you that no single probank could contribute more than 3. So because of this, the number of points will be capped, and the final score could be entered into the GCI at 3 points. So as Matt mentioned earlier, the GCI is not going to immediately reflect this change in scoring organization. That's something they're going to be working on over time. At this time, you're still going to need to select from the quote unquote old variant scoring categories, so loss of function, de novo, etc. The defaults programmed into the GCI may not reflect the recommended scoring yet, so you may need to manually adjust, what you always could do before. That's what you would just do now. So in addition to any notes you would normally make, you can also include just something like adjust default scoring per recommendations in SOP version 8 in the reason for change score field. And again, the GCI team is working on the necessary updates to enable this scoring. Other changes in SOP version 8, just a quick overview. There is a reminder to groups to enter the gene disease mode of inheritance and any pre-curation information into the gene tracker. We discussed a current workaround for including large intragenic CMVs in curation, and evidence summaries are now required. So on the topic of the gene tracker, again, like I said, there's just a reminder for any new groups to enter their gene lists into the gene tracker, and then for any groups to enter their pre-curation information into the gene tracker. Different GSEPs approach this different ways. Some GSEPs have all of their individual curators entering this information. Some GSEPs have their coordinator do it. Always check it with your group to see how they like to approach this. But doing this is essential for, especially now that we're having more and more GSEPs, to first of all, make sure we're not duplicating efforts. And then secondly, having this pre-curation information, it's eventually going to be displayed on our website. So it behooves us to enter this information into the system now. As I mentioned, we did include text just talking about a workaround for if you need to include or reference any intragenic CMVs in your curation. The GCI team, I think as Matt mentioned, is working on trying to make this possible in the GCI as well. That's that CACN ID thing that he mentioned. But for now, if you need to reference one of these variants, you can do so like in this example here, where you just simply note it in the evidence summary and note how many points it would receive. And then finally, again, Matt also mentioned this, that evidence summaries are now required. as part of the new release of the GCI, that field is not going to let you move on if you don't enter anything in that field. And I'm just pointing out to you now where you can find, if you need help thinking about what you might write in your evidence summary. We do have some suggested text, and you can find that on our website under gene disease validity and training materials. And as Jenny showed on the slide at the beginning of the call, Courtney and I are going to talk to you about this in more detail in February. So those were all the slides I had, and Courtney and I are both happy to take any questions.
One question I just wanted to bring up from the chat was whether or not any of the GSEPs are recording for any changes that they have. And yes, we do have an indication in the gene curation SOP about something we call a GSEP specification document. Some groups are using this. Some of you as biocurators may know this, but it's just a way for groups to document pieces of evidence that they want individuals to pay attention to and or think about different scoring. In general, this is to help consistency within the group, especially ones that have large gene lists, but also helps to point out, for instance, mouse models or animal models that may be appropriate to score or may not be based on the expert's opinion, as well as phenotypes that might be really important or critical for you to acknowledge whether it's present or absent from an individual. So
yeah, can I ask, are those published on the different GSEP like web pages, or like how are those disseminated so that if someone looks at, like, let's say a curation from one of those groups that has specified, then they just go get the regular gene curation SOP and say, oh, do you know what I mean? How?
Yeah, and most of these individuals are using it in their manuscripts, right? So generally for gene curation, the manuscript starts detailing out the materials and methods on how they use to evaluate. So some of them will be used for that. Certainly, this is not a required document at this point. That may change with time, which may make it more accessible. But I would say if you have any kind of question based on another groups or affiliations, curations, to go ahead and reach out to their coordinator and see what they can provide back for you and share.
Yeah, and I'll just provide anecdotal information. My groups have them, so like the ID autism and the epilepsy groups have them. We've been just keeping them within the group, and so when a new curator joins one of those groups, we give them access to it. It's currently in Google Doc form, and we're constantly iterating on it. We're always adding new things to it. And that's kind of one of the reasons why we've just kept it internal for now. But if any group is kind of on the fence of like, should we do this, should we not, I would put in a plug up for it, just for the very fact that as you get new curators, it's so helpful just to be able to say, oh, all right, here's where, you know, anything special that we do, it's all documented here. So you don't forget to tell somebody something or what have you. And then it helps keep you honest. You know, as you've been doing these things for years, or some groups, you know, that have large gene lists, they can be like, wait, what have we done in the past in this situation? I think it's really helpful to be able to go back and see what you've done.
We have one other question, Erin, I believe from Allison Kofi. Can you give some guidance on downgrading homozygous variants, or by how much to reduce points, accepting this is something for each GSEP to decide in context of their own gene disease area?
Yeah, I'm going to actually punt this question back to either you or Jenny, because you guys deal with autosomal recessive conditions more than I do. What do you guys normally do in your groups?
Yeah, I think it just depends on the level, again, on the homozygous individual, the functional data to support the variant pathogenicity and how well the testing is to rule out. Typically, I think we've gone with still, having a nice score with that functional evidence, especially when you take into effect the phenotype as well. If it's a really well-known phenotype and the person meets that phenotype, then you would clearly think that they have that gene disease relationship. And it could mean that you're underscoring, basically, right? Because the homozygous, if we don't know for sure how well it's been tested, could actually have an intronic splice site that's been missed, or it could have a larger gene deletion depending on the genotyping method. So that's typically how some of ours have approached it, is just trying to check out that phenotype and how well they feel the individual fits that. Is it a specific phenotype that would be with that gene compared to other evidence? And then the variant level impact.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Courtney. So most of my experience with this has been in the metabolic disorders. And so for those, we can have a lot of evidence ahead of time that the patient really has this condition based on analytes or enzyme activity. So even if it's a consanguineous patient, the parents are consanguineous, we may still just give the default points if there's functional evidence, because we're so convinced of the phenotype. We're more likely to downgrade if there's less evidence for the patient having that disorder. So yeah, it kind of just depends on the situation and the functional evidence available. Does that answer your question, Alison?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. It was just to get a bit more clarity around the wording that's in the GCI, but that's really helpful. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Okay, so any other questions?